Alright, in the last video we talked about the external genitalia. Now we're going to talk about the internal genitalia. And let's first start off and talk about the uterus. Right? The uterus here has three portions to it. It has the top portion, which I highlighted for you in green, called the fundus. Right? And the fundus, I like to think, kind of connects to the fallopian tube. We're going to talk about the fallopian tube in a second. The fundus is the top part of the uterus. The one in the yellow is the body of the uterus, right over here. So you have a body, right over here. And the bottom of the uterus is called the cervix, which I highlighted for you in blue. The cervix provides the opening to the vaginal canal, which is drawn for you over here, right? So this is the cervical canal, which is very, very narrow. And notice there's a large opening here called the vaginal canal, right? I like to think of the uterus. Notice the uterus has three parts: the fundus, the body, and the cervix. When you studied the stomach in the digestive system, the stomach also had three parts. Again, it had the fundus, which is the top part of the stomach, the body of the stomach, and the pylorus of the stomach. And remember what came after the pylorus of the stomach? Remember the pyloric sphincter, and then you have the duodenum. Right? So I love making these connections between your different body systems that you study. Right? The next part I like to talk about is the fallopian tube, right over here. The fallopian tube is where fertilization occurs between an egg and a sperm. Now, I'm saying fertilization. What I mean is, let's say there's sperm swimming up, right? The egg, let's say the egg is right over here, right? That fertilization occurs right over here, which is the fallopian tube. Now, don't get that confused with implantation, because once the sperm fertilizes the egg over here at the fallopian tube, this fertilized egg, called a zygote, eventually becomes what you call a blastocyst after development. And that whole implantation occurs right over here in the uterus. And I have this written for you over here. The fallopian tube is also known as the uterine tube, which is also known as the oviduct. They all mean the same thing. It's the region of fertilization, not implantation. All right. One condition I want to talk about, which we'll talk about later again, is called tubal ligation, right? So let me first tell you how a woman releases her eggs. So this is the ovaries right over here. This is one ovary. A woman has two ovaries, right? She's got another ovary over here. And once a month, she will release an egg, also known as an ovum. And that egg will swim all the way up to the fallopian tube, right? There's actually these hair-like characteristics called fimbriae. And they are ciliated, so they're going to move the hair into the fallopian tube. I'm sorry, they're going to move the egg into the fallopian tube, right? One process of sterilization is called a vasectomy, right? We learned that in males. Remember in males from the last chapter was if you wanted if a male was to be sterilized, you would just cut the vas deferens, right? And the sperm would die as soon as it was released from the epididymis, right? It would die right over here, right? After it gets released from the epididymis, it's going to die right in this region. and a man cannot produce sperm. I'm sorry, a man cannot ejaculate sperm. Right. In a woman, if we go back to this diagram, if she gets her tubes tied, right, so if you, let's say you tie this part of the tube over here, that egg can no longer reach the sperm, which is right over here. Therefore, fertilization cannot occur, right? And some of you are thinking, well, what's going to happen to the egg? What's going to happen to the sperm? They're both going to die, right? A woman can release about 400 eggs per lifetime, once a month from adolescent to menopause, right? Is it possible for a woman to reverse the process? It is difficult, right? But a woman can still get pregnant, right? If we took in, let's say a woman had her tubes tied right over here, and of course right over here, right? To fix that process is very difficult because typically there's a lot of scar tissue in that region to untie the tubes. But to actually have childbirth, right, it can possibly be done through in vitro fertilization, where the egg in green gets released from a woman, gets removed from a woman, and then it gets placed with the sperm, right? And once they're together, they implant this into a woman. The woman can't do it herself anymore, right? Let's talk about the uterus right over here, right? If we look at the uterus, it's got 3 layers. It's got an inner layer called the endometrium, right? That's where vascularization occurs. So when a woman is menstruating, right, she has a lot of blood vessels. Those blood vessels are actually produced at her endometrium. She's also got, if we go 1 layer in, she's got a myometrium, right? The myometrium, here I wrote, it contains oxytocin receptors. The myometrium, if you look at the word myo means muscles, right? And those muscles will contract and relax. They're smooth muscle, right? What's going to bind onto it? The oxytocin. Remember the function of oxytocin in the endocrine system? It was released by the posterior pituitary after being produced by the hypothalamus. Again, hypothalamus produces oxytocin, but it gets secreted by the posterior pituitary, right? And it binds onto the myometrium. And that myometrium initiates smooth muscle contractions, which makes it a lot easier for childbirth. The drug name for oxytocin, which you'll find in healthcare, is called Pitocin. And then there's a thin layer called the perimetrium. Here I wrote for you, it's a layer of simple squamous epithelial membrane, right? Here again is everything I just showed you before, right? You've got the ovaries, right? The ovaries typically release an egg, which is called the ovum, and the ovum, or ovum, actually would get fertilized by sperm inside the fallopian tube.